Welcome to the TTT News Special. I'm DK Roster, and we are discussing science fiction. Now, not any normal sort of science fiction, but Caribbean science fiction with the founder of the Caribbean Science Fiction Network podcast, Jarrel De Matas. Now, Jarrel is a teaching associate at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Now, he's also a PhD student in English literature, and his main research interests involve Caribbean science fiction. However, he also has interest in children's literature, superhero fantasy, and he's written for a range of journals and topics concerning race and superhero identities, as well as horror fiction. Now, he has several published articles in local and foreign newspapers as well as magazines, and we welcome him to this conversation. How you do, Jarrel?
I'm fine, thanks, DK. Excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm wondering, though, what makes you want to travel the road of exposing this type of genre expression to the general public?
So science fiction has always been my passion, and it was only natural that I bring my experience as a PhD student in Caribbean literature along with it. So it brings that passion together, and it also fills a void. Um, it, when I search in creating this podcast, I was searching for Caribbean science fiction, and there were one, maybe two episodes available on Apple Podcasts. No specific podcast that deals exclusively with Caribbean science fiction. So that was really the reason. One, passion, and on the other hand, filling that void. I knew that there was a gap to be filled, and it was only natural that I chose the passion to drive that void.
It always makes sense to follow your passion because sometimes when resources and other things drive, you still have your passion to help you take one step in front of the other. But you spoke about a void and a gap in podcasts, though. But is that gap also represented in literature? So podcast versus literature, is that gap the same?
Yeah, I would say in podcasting more, but the same issue remains, which is a lack of exposure, a lack of accessibility. Um, when people ask me what is my research, and I say Caribbean science fiction, the answer is always that's a thing. What is Caribbean science fiction? And this idea for the podcast, which is driven by my PhD research and my what will eventually be my dissertation. It's driven by that need to address questions of accessibility or lack thereof, and also the lack of representation for Caribbean literature. So for podcasting, it's a bit less. There's more for void because podcasting in the Caribbean isn't as popular. It's seen as a US thing in terms of popularity. So in that way, there's less access to it. And by making this Caribbean science fiction available to a wider audience, I think it will help boost that accessibility as well as make it a bit more mainstream. One of the episodes I had so far, the first episode, we talked about changing the mainstream and what does it mean to be outside of the mainstream. And the discussion was, well, if you're not included in the mainstream, then change the mainstream, change what it means to be mainstream. And this podcast, the ultimate goal really is to change how podcasting may be perceived in the Caribbean because it might not be very popular, as well as change the mainstream as it relates to Caribbean science fiction.
Now, I'm smiling listening to you say this because I remember signing up for a course once in terms of folktales and the sensibilities in the Caribbean. And they weren't able to have the course that year because I showed up for the course and there was a young lady from Russia. We didn't have the quorum needed. But that mainstream, what are some of those things that you see in the mainstream, and what are some of those things that you think make them popular enough to become the mainstream, if not the status quo?
Yes, I think it really comes down to like representation, like who do you see on the screen really, and who is left out of that picture. And I want to draw a quick reference to Black Panther, for example, because that sort of changed the typical superhero by putting that black superhero in well, a fictional land which could be perceived as Africa. Um, that movie changed the mainstream of the typical superhero. So I think on the one hand, it's representation. Who are you seeing on the screen? And as it relates to this podcast, who are you hearing? What language is being spoken? What is being written or filmed? So I think it really comes down to who you're seeing, who is being broadcasted, because that is what drives the mainstream. The mainstream is only that because it has been bolstered by popularity. It has been bolstered by who has access to the power, who is creating it, who has the money to buy these things, who has the money to advertise. So it's really driven by that idea of power and who has access to create these things. And one of the things I like about what I've discovered about this podcast and podcasting in general is that it's quite easy to create a podcast. There was a bit of a learning curve with it in terms of like figuring out just like images and figuring out like how to edit, which I'm slowly getting into. But once I figured it out, once I figured the skill set needed, I realized how easy it could be. And I think that is one of the steps necessary in changing the mainstream. If more people like me can take on these kinds of projects, we will slowly begin to see more podcasts with the word Caribbean in it, and in that way, the mainstream is gradually changed.
And with regard to the issue of representation that you would have mentioned, it makes me want to ask the question, what is the relevance of literature in general and then Caribbean science fiction in particular? Because and I have this against the backdrop of what defines text, because I've been wrestling with what defines academic text, but we can get into that in just a little bit. But the relevance of literature and Caribbean science fiction literature in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, just drawing from personal experience, I've done 3 years of BA literature, 2 years of masters, and I'm going to my third year for PhD, all in literature, which is, I, I'm not like tooting my own horn here, but I am exceptional in that regard. And why I think why literature is so important, I think. Let me give you this scenario. You go to a doctor to be healed or cured. You go to a lawyer to be acquitted or defended. You go to an architect to have something built. And what I see in these professions is they can do things, they can do sort of practical things for you. And I always say when you go to literature, you learn to be more human. It shows you something that these professions cannot. And literature is all of that combined. It is philosophy, it's history, it's language, it's medicine, it's law, it's architecture. So I think this is what has driven my passion to be in literature. The fact that it is part of the humanities faculty for a reason. It teaches us how to be human, and I think that is really lacking in society, in the world. And I'm couching this Caribbean science fiction within that bigger idea of what it means to be human, because these texts so far that I've already looked at in the podcast, they're looking at ways to be human in the future, yet drawing on historical tropes. So therefore, as much as they are portraying how to be human in the future, that humanity is still rooted in the past. And this critical awareness by way of literature, I think, has given me the skill to bring that to the fore, really. And this podcast is really, like I said, accessibility is a big thing for me, because I want people to be aware of what is happening in the Caribbean, particularly for Caribbean science fiction, because for so long, the people in the Caribbean have been told that they've been something outside of humanity. Centuries of colonialism have taught us that we are set apart, we're third world, with the global south. So there's that disparity of power. But I think the literature really does show us how to be human, and the science fiction, how to be human in the future.
But Jarrell, in terms of that moving from the periphery to the center in the way that we see ourselves, if even not the way that others see us, I want to bring that up in the other side of the conversation though. But we take a short break. We're speaking with Jarrell De Matas about Caribbean science fiction and the podcast to deal with that. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are speaking with Jarrell De Matas, founder of the Caribbean Science Fiction Network podcast. And we've been talking a little about the need for something like this, the gap that was realized or observed. But Jarrell, you've had two episodes thus far. And take me through those episodes, thank you. Who did you speak with? What were some of the things? Because you already hinted to it, but carry me a little further down the rabbit hole.
I was fortunate to have these two texts. I mean, you drew reference to what counts as a text, and I was fortunate to have as the first two episodes one soon to be released film and one debut book, a collection of short stories. So I'm making a plug here. The podcast is looking not just at books but also film, local film, Caribbean film. So the first episode, I interviewed the co-creator of Jumbie, which is the Trinidadian folklore animation, soon to be released. Their pilot is soon to be released next year in February. And the second episode was Trisha Chin, a debut writer with the collection Tabanka and Other Stories. Both of them looking at folklore, but through different lenses. So in the first episode, Everard being the co-creator of Jumbie, we talked about the trailer for Jumbie and the observations and the thoughts that it sort of it brought to the fore then. We talked about gender because Jumbie is a young Black girl, which is extremely important in terms of representation again, and particularly for the Caribbean. We looked at what it means to be a folklore character in the Caribbean. People outside looking at the Caribbean, what does a Jumbie signify? And how this film could potentially challenge the stereotypes that people may have about us, as well as stereotypes we may have about ourselves. I mean, people in Trinidad may look at the Jumbie as Everard said, as devil thing. So that's an extremely important idea to put forward, especially for people in Trinidad, because we are the ones now responsible for generating the image that we want of ourselves. So it's extremely important in that regard. As far as the second episode goes, Trisha Chin and the debut collection also looking at folklore, but what I noticed was this collection was heavily influenced and driven by folklore characters who may be perceived as non-human. Again, ideas of representation and perceptions of who we are. So, the collection was also interesting because ideas of the environment came up and how is the environment perceived in relation not just to folklore but also in the Caribbean. So, 2 episodes so far looking at folklore yet generating 2 different ideas. And I've already interviewed the third person for the third episode, so you can look forward to that. I so far broadcast episodes bi-weekly every Friday, so the third episode is going to be released this Friday.
And with that in mind though, in terms of speaking to 2 individuals who are looking at folklore, but from their perception, there's a difference in the way that they articulate from that similar reference point. What does this say about the importance of exploring voices of the Caribbean, of this space?
Yeah, and in addition to voices, also different mediums. I mean, I would love to do things on like performance arts, for example, but I'm restricted in terms of what I can access. So in terms of the different voices, I think it's important to get that broader view and how different people are speaking to similar issues, but they're relying on their own experience. So for example, Everard talked about where the idea for a female superhero came from, which was rooted in his own experience with his own experience of being surrounded by strong women. And Trisha Chin, she did write about fictional Chinese characters, but she still has that influence. And in the second episode, where we talked about the environment, she talked about walking with her grandmother through the countryside, and her grandmother would tell her stories, and that informed her collection, Trisha Chin, that is. So, we have these, each of us, we have these individual stories driving these narratives of what it means to be Caribbean. And I think it's extremely important to get to that source, because there's the Caribbean is so diverse, yet there's a similarity, there's a thread binding all of us together. And in that diversity, there's a sort of there's stability to our history and to our common experience then of being Caribbean. So I think it's extremely important to not just get not just get the history of the work, but the history of the authors and these filmmakers who are driving these works.
Now, I looked at your website and I saw that there was a bibliography of Caribbean science fiction and fantasy. I don't know if that is some of your schoolwork bleeding into the website, but at the same time, where did you find most of those titles coming from, and what do you think that says about the space?
So what I think that bibliography, so that's not mine, that was a curated list that I did use as a reference source, but again, it has done a good job of introducing us to some of the works, but there's so much more to be looked at. In terms of the titles, I would have reached out to, because I'm a PhD student, I would have come into contact with authors and these filmmakers and in different capacities. And what I've looked at so far, I'm also relying on the people that I know. And this is what really is sort of driving the episodes, and I'm really relying on people that I've come into contact with, because they are ultimately the ones who are going to be populating this podcast. The ultimate goal, I would want to see that bibliography updated, and to include other mediums, because, for example, the film, we have the flexibility. We can own this. It's not just, I mean, science fiction is one thing, but I'm looking at something much more. So fantasy, folklore, horror, these different genres that all speak to our identity. And as Trisha Chin put it, they are outside the realm of explanation. They can only be portrayed or highlighted.
But speaking to the flexibility, Jarrel, we don't have that much flexibility in terms of having just under a minute. So how do people tune in? How do people engage with the podcast? How do people share? What platforms can they find it?
Okay, so it's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor.fm, Breaker, there's Radio Public. Now, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, they may have geographic or device restrictions, but Anchor.fm is much more user-friendly and much more accessible. So I would suggest that our listeners go to Anchor.fm, type in Caribbean Science Fiction Network, and you will see it. You can also do a Google search, and it will come up as well. You can also check out the social media platforms on Twitter and Instagram, Caribbean SFNet. And so you can check that out. And if there's anyone listening who thinks they want to be featured, you can also shoot me an email, caribbeansfnet@gmail.com. When something is unique, when you can have the same name across multiple platforms. And the Caribbean SFNet, no one had that. So that's another nod to the idea of the void that is being filled.
All right. Thank you so much, Jarrel De Matas, founder of the Caribbean Science Fiction Network podcast. And we want to thank you on behalf of the entire news team for joining us. Have a good one.